Today we have a student question, so let's go ahead and read it. While reading the passages, I feel like the words are just passing by my eyes, and at the same time, I get nothing out at all from the passage. Neither its general idea, nor the plot, what's going on in the passage. This problem occurs while reading literature and history passages. Can you please guide me about what to do to recover from this problem? So this is certainly something that you've experienced before. I know I have. You're reading something, whether you're reading a passage for the SAT, or the ACT, or something for your English class or history, or just anything you're reading for fun, and you've realized that you've just read a whole page or half a page, and you don't remember anything that you read. It's like your eyes were moving and you were kind of looking at the words, but your brain was someplace else, right? Very frustrating, and especially when you're dealing with a timed test, obviously pretty problematic because you have to get going. You got to answer questions. So what I want to talk about in this video are some ways to address this issue and minimize its impact. Because zoning out, as we'll call it, right, when you're just reading and you don't remember, or you just kind of lose track of where you are and you have to kind of start over, totally normal. It happens. All we can do is minimize it. We're not going to be able to eliminate it because no one's perfect. Our attention's always going to wander. Our focus is going to be imperfect. All we can do is minimize when this happens and minimize the damaging effects of this zoning out for the SAT and the ACT. So as soon as you notice your attention drifting, first thing to do, just kind of a pep talk, bring it back to where you left off in the passage. Just go back to where the first thing that you can remember reading, or the last thing you can remember reading, and be kind to yourself. Don't be hard on yourself. Don't kick yourself and say, oh, I shouldn't have done that. It happens. Take it as a learning experience. Go back. Keep reading from where you left off. And more importantly, keep calm. So I know on the time tests, the time pressure, especially on the ACT reading, is pretty rough, but you have to keep calm. As soon as you start working yourself up and those stress hormones get dumped into your bloodstream, it makes things a lot worse. So keep calm, be kind to yourself, pick up where you left off. In terms of specific strategies that we can use, I've got a number of strategies that might help you moving forward when it comes to trying to address this issue. Again, all we can do is minimize it. We can't eliminate it, but these strategies might at least help. And a lot of these strategies are going to be dependent on the test you're taking. I'm not going to go into specific details about how these might vary for the SAT or the ACT or any other activity you might be doing with reading, but you can adjust them, adapt them depending on the strategies you're using, the assignment, whatever it is you're doing. So the first strategy is when you're doing your SAT or your ACT, you're reading your passages, focus instead on the question or the questions rather than worrying about necessarily at first the passage as a whole. So you're going to use these questions as a filter. You're going to use it as a way to realize, okay, I've got a bunch of text here, but what's actually going to be important? What are they actually going to ask me about? What do I have to understand when I'm reading the passage in order to answer questions? So your questions are going to give you something to focus on rather than kind of reading through the whole thing randomly. You're not really sure what's going to be important or what's not. You're using the questions as a filter, and you're going to use them so that you can do what's called active reading. In other words, reading with a purpose. You're reading to answer a specific question, not reading the whole thing to get a general sense of what's going on. That's for later. When you're answering questions, the focus is on answering questions and finding the relevant information in the text, like you're a detective. Second point is a general point that I make constantly, but it's so important to reiterate. It's to keep moving. So don't get hung up on parts of the passage until you have to worry about those parts of the passage to answer a specific question. If you find yourself reading and rereading the same paragraph again and again, it's a bad use of your time. Move on, answer everything else, answer the other questions of that set or even of the entire test, and then go back and worry about that question, worry about that part of the passage. You just can't get hung up reading and rereading something if it's just for one question, right? Keep moving. Answer everything else first, and then worry about that question after. The third point is to kind of related to focus on the questions, is to focus on chunks of texts rather than the whole thing. So this a little bit depends on which test you're taking, whether it's the SAT or the ACT. There's a little bit of a difference in terms of the overall strategy. But just in general, instead of worrying about digesting and reading the whole thing and getting lost and getting sidetracked, you're focusing on chunks. So let's say might focus on the first 2 or 3 paragraphs to answer one question, or maybe one set of lines to answer another question. It's all about focusing on smaller chunks. So what you're doing is you're taking a really big passage and you're breaking it up into more manageable pieces so you can keep your focus where it needs to be, which is always, as I always stress, answering questions. That's what gets you points. Not necessarily understanding the passage as a whole or this or that. It's answering questions. So always we focus on answering those questions and making sure everything that we do is geared towards that goal. Some general points in terms of reading in general. These may be more applicable not only to the SAT or ACT, but to anything you're reading to help keep your focus and interest. And that is to, when you're reading, trying to get like the main idea or the general sense of the passage, what you want to focus on is contrast, difference, and controversy. So when you're paying attention, when you're reading your passage, you want to look for places in the text where there's contrasts in ideas, or contrasts in what one person believes and another person believes, where there's differences in, again, what one person believes or another person believes, or differences in how the text is structured, or what the author is focusing on from one part to the next. You want to focus on controversies. What disagreements do people have? What disagreements do different groups have? How do ideas differ? This has 2 purposes. Number 1, generally speaking, contrast, difference, disagreement is more interesting than a bunch of random facts or people agreeing all the time. Generally speaking, it's more interesting. It helps keep our focus. But second, and perhaps more important, when you focus on difference and contrast and who says what, that's going to help you develop a sense of the main idea of the passage. Because the main idea of a passage, or talking particularly about nonfiction, is often dependent on the context, dependent on what is this passage trying to say? With whom does it agree? With whom does it disagree? And all that stuff kind of goes together. So if you focus on that, those differences, those contrasts, that can help keep your focus where it needs to be. This next piece of advice is one you might have heard, and I'm going to just throw it out there because just to be thorough, but I'll talk about in a second why I don't think it's the best piece of strategy, and that's to pretend to be interested in the passage. Often on these tests, you have pretty boring topics, so it's hard to actually be interested in what you're reading. But sometimes it's suggested that if you pretend to be interested, if you pretend to enjoy what you're reading, that may help your levels of focus. And I think there's limits to this, of course. Pretending to be interested is not as good as actually being interested. But I do think there is something of value in this, in the sense that anything you read, with maybe a few exceptions, anything you read does have its interesting points, can be related to aspects of your life, aspects of your experience, something you've never thought before. It might pique your curiosity in a particular way. So just be, I guess we can say, be open to the passage, right? Even though it may be something that may at first seem boring, perhaps not when you get really into the details and the grit of it. And the final tip, which is perhaps a more general tip overall, is to practice, practice, practice. A strong reader is more or less made, not born. Certainly, there might be differences in processing speeds and blah, 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 but most of the time it's about how many hours, how many words have you read throughout your entire life? What kinds of effective, important reading have you done over the long term, right? Reading is a skill that you build up over a long period of time. It's like building a muscle. So in order to get better at reading, you have to read. You have to read carefully. You have to think about what you've read. And in addition, when you're doing the SAT or ACT, you got to do practice sections in a consistent way. Because the great thing about the SAT, ACT when it comes to practicing reading is you have a really useful check on how well you understand the passage, which you may not have when you normally read, because there's going to be questions to check your understanding. So it's a nice way of figuring out, all right, what am I getting here? What am I not getting? What do I need to improve on? What do I not need to improve on? All right, so that's it for this video. Let me know if you have any comments or questions or any strategies that you might use to help avoid zoning out. As always, if you have any questions and want to maybe get one of those featured in one of the future episodes of the series, just send an email to ask@reasonprep.com and be happy to take a look at your question. To learn more about Reason Prep's SAT, SAT subject test, and ACT video courses, go to reasonprep.com/enroll, and you can find the link in the description below the video.